In the shadow of the towering St. Peter's Basilica, a place where millions of faithful have come to seek solace and absolution, a dark and twisted chapter of history lies buried, waiting to be unearthed. Imagine a time when the Church, the very institution that preached love, forgiveness, and humility, was a den of corruption, violence, and debauchery. This is not the story of a few bad apples. It's the story of an entire system gone wrong. A time when the highest ranks of the Church were filled with men who cared more about power, pleasure, and wealth than the souls they were supposed to shepherd. In the early 16th century, the Catholic Church was not the beacon of light and moral authority that many of us might imagine. It was a place where the worst human vices flourished, and the line between the sacred and the profane was often blurred beyond recognition. One of the most shocking examples of this moral decay is the story of Alfonso Cardinal Petrucci, a high-ranking church official who was strangled with a red silk noose in a gruesome execution. The executioner was a Moor, a non-Christian, because Vatican etiquette at the time forbade Christians from killing a prince of the church. This bizarre rule underscores the twisted logic that governed the church in those days. Cardinal Petrucci's fate was sealed in 1517 when he led a conspiracy to assassinate Pope Leo X. The plan was to poison the Pope by injecting a deadly substance into his buttock, under the pretext of lancing a boil. However, the conspiracy was betrayed by a servant, and Petrucci's accomplices were eventually caught. While some of the conspirators were pardoned after paying huge fines, Raphael Cardinal Riario, a great-nephew of a previous pope, paid a staggering 150,000 ducats. Petrucci himself was not so lucky. His execution was a stark reminder of the brutal nature of power struggles within the church. But the violence and corruption did not stop at the upper echelons. Diplomats and envoys stationed in Rome during this period left behind accounts that paint a grim picture of the city. One envoy from Lombardy wrote of murders innumerable. One hears nothing but moaning and weeping. In all the memory of man, the church has never been in such an evil plight. The Venetian ambassador later reported that every night 4 or 5 murdered men are discovered, bishops, prelates, and others. These accounts suggest that the lower classes in Rome were also subjected to a wave of violence that seemed to go unchecked. Despite the constant bloodshed, the city of Rome had a remarkable ability to forget. Once the killers' knives had clotted and dried, and the bodies were buried or thrown into the Tiber River, the mood often turned hedonistic. Pope Leo X, who presided over this period of moral decay, famously wrote to his brother, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." This attitude of indulgence and excess was not limited to the Pope. The prelates of that age had insatiable appetites for pleasure. One of the most infamous examples is Pietro Cardinal Riario, who hosted a lavish banquet that featured a roasted bear holding a staff in its jaws, stags reconstructed in their skins, and herons and peacocks in their feathers. The guests' behavior at this banquet was described as orgiastic, drawing parallels to the ancient Roman model of excess and debauchery. The Church's transformation from a spiritual institution to a place of worldly indulgence was gradual but profound. In previous centuries, when the Church had reason to celebrate, it would open St. Peter's Basilica for solemn Te Deums of thanksgiving. But by the time of Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, prayer had become unfashionable. When Alexander heard that Castilian Catholics had defeated the Moors of Granada, he did not call for a prayer service. Instead, he organized a bullfight in the Piazza of St. Peter's and cheered as 5 bulls were slain. This event, like many others, revealed a church that was hopelessly at odds with the teachings of Jesus, whose existence was the very reason for the church's existence. The decline of the church was not an overnight phenomenon. It was the result of a long process of moral decay that had its roots in the church, its growing popularity and wealth. As Christianity expanded through mass conversions, the church's leaders began to accommodate their message to attract more followers. This meant toning down their exhortations and making the faith more palatable to a broader audience. While this strategy may have helped the church grow, it also led to a dilution of its core values. One of the most significant sources of corruption was the church's wealth. Donations from the faithful poured in, and much of this unspent wealth found its way to the ecclesiastical hierarchy, where it accumulated and led to a culture of dissipation and debauchery. The church's leaders, now flush with cash, began to spend lavishly on entertainment, gambling, and other vices. They hired orchestras to play while they feasted, organized elaborate theatrical performances, and engaged in bawdy behavior with women from the city's brothels. This hedonistic lifestyle was a far cry from the humble and pious lives that Jesus and his disciples had led. The church's moral decline also led to the introduction of a dangerous practice, the sale of indulgences. In ancient Germanic culture, convicted criminals could choose to be punished or pay a fine weigeld if they were wealthy enough. The church, in its quest for more money, adopted a similar practice, allowing people to buy their way out of sin. This practice, known as the sale of indulgences, was a sacrilegious departure from the early Christian tradition of atonement through confession, absolution, and penance. The church justified this practice by citing a verse from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus tells Peter, "I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." This verse, however, was a flimsy foundation for a practice that would eventually lead to widespread abuse. The sale of indulgences became a lucrative business, with a bureaucracy that extended from the Pope down to the lowliest friar. The church's leaders, now empowered to forgive sins for a price, sent out agents to collect money from the faithful. These agents, known as indulgence preachers, traveled throughout Europe, promising salvation to those who could afford to pay. The system was ripe for abuse, and many preachers took advantage of their positions, collecting more money than necessary and pocketing a portion for themselves. The most notorious example of this abuse was the work of Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar who became infamous for his aggressive sales tactics. Tetzel was known for his catchy slogans, such as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." This phrase, which promised immediate salvation for a price, captured the imagination of many believers and filled the church's coffers. However, it also sparked a backlash, particularly from a German monk named Martin Luther, who would go on to challenge the church's practices and launch the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation was a direct response to the corruption and moral decay that had taken hold of the church. Luther, who had been a devout Catholic, was appalled by the sale of indulgences and other practices that he saw as contrary to the teachings of the Bible. In 1517, he nailed his 95 theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, a document that criticized the church's practices and called for reform. Luther's bold act set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the face of Christianity. The Reformation was not just a religious movement. It was also a social and political revolution. It challenged the authority of the Pope and the church hierarchy, and it inspired people to think critically about their faith. The movement spread rapidly throughout Europe, leading to the formation of new Protestant denominations and a shift in the balance of power between the church and secular authorities. While the Reformation brought about many positive changes, it also led to years of conflict and bloodshed. Wars of religion broke out across Europe as Protestant and Catholic forces fought for control. These conflicts, known as the Wars of Religion, lasted for decades and caused immense suffering. However, they also forced the church to confront its own corruption and to make efforts to reform. In the centuries that followed, the church underwent significant changes. The Council of Trent, which met between 1545 and 1563, addressed many of the issues that had led to the Reformation. The Council reaffirmed the importance of the sacraments, clarified the role of the Pope, and condemned the sale of indulgences. It also introduced new measures to improve the moral and spiritual lives of the clergy. These reforms helped to restore some of the Church's credibility and moral authority. Today, the Catholic Church is a very different institution from the one that existed in the 16th century. While it still faces challenges and controversies, it has made significant strides in addressing the issues that led to its moral decay. The Church continues to play a vital role in the lives of millions of people around the world, providing spiritual guidance, social services, and a sense of community. However, the history of the Church during the Renaissance serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of moral integrity. It is a story that should be remembered and reflected upon, not just by those who are part of the Church, but by anyone who values the principles of justice, compassion, and ethical leadership. The dark chapter of the Church's history is a cautionary tale that teaches us the importance of vigilance and the need to hold our leaders accountable. It reminds us that even the most revered institutions can fall into corruption if they lose sight of their core values. In the end, the story of the Church during the Renaissance is not just a story of the past. It is a story that continues to resonate in the present and will undoubtedly shape the future.